Hey there, friends. Welcome to episode 23 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. And in today's episode, we are going to be looking at buttonholes, just as soon as my dog stops fluffing the pillow. Okay, so we're going to be talking about buttonholes today. And just a little note to those of you who watched last week's episode where we talked all about drop shoulder style sweaters and specifically how the width relates to the sleeve length. I had a comment on last week's video that needed some clarification. So at the end of today's episode, we are going to just work on that a little bit more just to make sure that there's no more confusion about how the two relate. I am filming this today, today. It is Monday, August 14th, and friends, it is so hot. We are scheduled for a high of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is just around 40 or 41 degrees Celsius. So you're getting a very barefaced, barely coiffed Megan today. It is too hot to do my hair. I had hoped to be wearing a garment with buttons and therefore buttonholes on it so we could talk about it with some practical examples. But I can't do much more than wear a t-shirt and put on a little mascara today. So we are going to just use lots of examples on the screen throughout the video. So I hope my picture taking skills are up to snuff for what we're going to be talking about today. So in knitting, we have horizontal buttonholes and vertical buttonholes. We use different methods to create both, but I thought I would take a look at why we have different methods. So a horizontal buttonhole is created to allow play in a garment. A button the ideal buttonhole is about the size of the diameter of the button, so you don't get as much play as you would see in the example I have on the screen. Obviously, this is exaggerated, but largely when you have a horizontal buttonhole like this, your button can move back and forth within that hole, but not up and down a whole lot because your buttonhole is really only one row tall. Conversely, a vertical buttonhole does the opposite. It allows for vertical movement of the button and therefore, I suppose, the two halves of the garment side by side, vertical relative to each other, but it doesn't allow for horizontal play because, again, your buttonhole, relatively speaking, is only about one stitch or one row wide, depending on how you've constructed it. And so I thought it would be kind of cool to go look at the buttons, or rather the buttonholes on my shirts. I put them on many days in a week and actually didn't really pay that much attention to the buttonholes. And I found something that at least I thought was kind of interesting. All of my sort of indoor garments, button-down shirts, whether it was flannel, denim, or cotton, all of the buttonholes were vertical, except for the buttonhole at the top of the shirt. And then when I went to my closet and looked at my jackets, all of the buttonholes were horizontal. And I think, as just going back to what I talked about just a minute ago about horizontal play versus vertical play in our buttonholes, I think we use them in different ways. So, with vertical buttonholes, you do get your fabrics could potentially move up and down. Now, I don't know that I think that there's much need for that. I don't think garments are designed specifically to allow vertical play, but please, if you know differently than I do, leave a comment below the video because I would love to learn. But more importantly, what the vertical buttonhole doesn't do is allow the garment to do this, right? Our button plackets overlap and they stay in position, which if you're wearing a blouse or a button-down shirt, you generally don't want a lot of horizontal movement between those two pieces of fabric. You want the two plackets to stay lined up and your garment to stay closed. With the horizontal buttonhole at the neckline, I think that is more to accommodate perhaps different circumference of necks, granted over a very small scale. You don't have much more than about 1/4 inch there. A different neck circumference relative to the body that's going into it. However, with outerwear, because what we put under a specific garment can vary so much in its bulk, I think the buttonholes are created horizontally to allow some variance in the circumference of the garment. Again, it's not that much difference, but the buttons, and therefore the buttonholes on outdoor garments, do tend to be larger. So I just thought that was kind of fascinating. I have spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks looking at the construction of buttonholes, but didn't dive super deep into why we use the two sets of buttonholes. But that's where my mind went. So take all of that with a grain of salt, but it'll help us form some opinions about when we're creating our next garment, whether we want vertical buttonholes or horizontal buttonholes. Are you going to wear it as your only layer, and therefore it's going to stay buttoned up and you want everything to stay lined up? You want to use vertical buttonholes. If you might wear it as a bit of a shell that it may hang open, or you may close it over a layer that you're wearing, you might want to use horizontal buttonholes so you can accommodate different sizes of garments underneath it. I don't know, just food for thought. But now let's take a look at how buttonholes are constructed. So there are any number of ways that you can create buttonholes in your garment, and the method that you choose will probably relate into how you're creating your button band. If you are picking up and knitting stitches along an edge, and therefore your button band is running the opposite direction of the stitches that you knit in the garment, you might choose one method. Whereas if you are knitting your button band in line with your sweater, either at the same time or separately and then sewn, so that your button band and your garment are knit in the same direction, you might choose a different method. So let's take a look at what I think of as the 4 or maybe 3.5 different methods that come to top of mind for me as the most common ways of creating buttonholes. Method 1 is the simplest out there. It's combining a yarn over with a decreased stitch. You're simply putting a tiny hole in your work and then decreasing it out either right before you work the yarn over or right after the yarn over, so you're not actually increasing your stitch count, you're just creating a hole in your work. Of course, the limitation with that is that the size of hole you create is correlated to the size of yarn you're using and the size of needle you're using. So the variance in button options are fairly small. I'm going to call this method 1.5 because it's really just a play on what I just said, is instead of doing a single yarn over with a single decrease, you can use a double yarn over with a decrease on either side of it. It doesn't change the vertical distance of your buttonhole, it's still just 1 row tall, but it'll now be 2 stitches wider. So if you have a fairly lightweight garment and you want to put a button that is not super tiny on your garment, you could use a double yarn over method. Again, though, you are still somewhat limited by your gauge. Your hole is only going to be about the width of 2 stitches wide. So method 2, the full method, I think would be the 1 row buttonhole. This is very common and can be worked horizontally or vertically up your work, depending on which direction you are working your buttonholes. But basically the way this is constructed is over 1 row of knitting, you are binding off a number of stitches and then casting on the same number of stitches, casting back on the same number of stitches on 1 row of work. So you're not really interrupting too much patterning. It's a really secure way to work a buttonhole. And the nice thing about it is it doesn't create a very tall buttonhole, so you don't end up with a big vertical gap, but it allows you to set the width of your buttonhole. So if you have a very specific size of button that you want to use, regardless of whether you're using a finer yarn and smaller needle size, you can determine how large you want that buttonhole to be. So the third method of creating a buttonhole that I have used is called the vertical buttonhole. It is worked between the columns of your stitches. If you look at the example on the screen, what you're doing is basically knitting one side of the buttonhole, completely omitting the other side, just letting it hang out unworked. And then once you create the total depth of the vertical buttonhole that you want, you break your yarn at the top edge, rejoin it at the little blue dot that you can see in the example on the screen, and then continue knitting up your work on the other side. When both sides of your buttonholes are even, you now continue up the work across the entire width of the button band. Let's take a look at a practical application of each of these buttonhole methods that I've just described. We're going to look at garments where you have knit the body and then you have picked up and knit the stitches along the front edge, versus working your garment where the button lines are worked in line with the knitting that you're doing. So we'll take a look at the first example where we're going to pick up and knit stitches along the edge of a garment. This picture obviously shows just a cardigan with a regular crew neck collar. The same would be applied to a garment that has a shawl collar, where you would work all the way around the entirety of the neckline. The stitches that you pick up and knit along the edge are going to be worked perpendicular to the direction that you knit your garment. So if we start with the yarn over buttonholes method, and I'm going to cover both the single yarn over and the double yarn over method because they're created so similarly in this example. Because we're now working perpendicular to the stitches that we picked up, our buttonholes that we create will be vertical. Now, verticality relative to one stitch for a single yarn over is probably not quite accurate, but you are creating the yarn over the width of a stitch, which is now running this way up your body. So it would be one row tall this direction and one row wide this direction. Hopefully the example on the screen is giving you a good visual of what I mean by that. Similar to the yarn over buttonhole methods, a buttonhole created using the one row buttonhole method is going to create a vertical buttonhole up the edge of your work. It will still only be one row tall, so in that respect it will be very similar width-wise to a yarn over buttonhole. However, because you can choose to cast on or bind off more stitches or fewer stitches based on the size of your buttonhole, you have a lot of control over how large your buttonhole gets to be. I don't have a tutorial for the one row buttonhole specifically, but I do have a link to how to work this method in the description below the video. Let's take a quick look at the third method that I discussed a few moments ago, the vertical buttonhole method. In this application, it's a bit of a misnomer. You are working a buttonhole vertically up the work that you are knitting. So because you're knitting this way up and down your work, your buttonhole will be created this way. But that's horizontal relative to how you wear the garment. So it is a bit of a misnomer. This method would likely not be used on a button band that is picked up and knit perpendicular to your garment. It would be pretty cumbersome and it would result in a lot of ends to weave in, but just to leave no stone unturned, this is what it would look like. To begin the button band, you will pick up and knit the entire length of the button band for a few rows. To create the actual buttonholes themselves, you will continue flat, but if we look at the bottom of the blow-up circle, you will only be knitting the rows up to the starting point of your first buttonhole. And you'll be working short rows, not actually using the short row method, but your rows will not be the entire length of your button band. So you will work your short rows up until the buttonhole reaches its desired width. Then you're going to break your yarn and rejoin it at the blue hole at the bottom, or closest to the bottom of this bubble. You're going to then knit the space between the bottom buttonhole you just created and the second buttonhole on your button band until you reach the same depth. Then you're going to break your yarn again and knit on the other side of the buttonhole. So you can see why that method of construction for a horizontal buttonhole when you've worked up into a picked up edge is probably not the best application, but I like to make sure that there's no questions unanswered. Now let's take a look at inline button bands. Inline button bands can be worked one of two ways. It can be worked at the same time that you knit your sweater. A good example of this would be the LYS, sweater from Andrea Mowry, and I'm using these pictures with her permission. Or you can knit your button band completely separate, only casting on a number of stitches that you need for your button band, working the entire button band flat all on its own, and then seaming it to the garment. Another example of this from Andrea would be the Douglas cardigan. Although the button band looks seamless on the sweater, it is actually knit separately and then seamed onto the garment. So inline button bands are created in the same direction that the garment is created, meaning that when we use the methods that we've just discussed for a pick up and knit button band, our buttonholes are going to result in the opposite orientation. So the yarn over, double yarn over, and one row buttonholes, when they are worked in line with the garment, are now going to be horizontal buttonholes. So it's a lot easier to create horizontal buttonholes that way. To create vertical buttonholes, buttonholes, I'm saying buttonholes and button bands so many times I'm getting confused. To create vertical buttonholes in line with your garment, whether it's actually knit as part of the garment or on its own separate button band, you'll want to use the vertical buttonhole method. This is slightly less cumbersome now because you're just knitting one buttonhole at a time, but you still do have to work each side of the buttonhole separately. So you would knit up one side of the buttonhole to create the right edge of the buttonhole, break your yarn, rejoin it at the blue dot that's at the bottom of the buttonhole, knit up the left edge of the buttonhole until it's the same height as the right, and then continue in your work all the way across the button band until it's time to create your next buttonhole. So in some cases, a pattern will call for double wide button bands. And in that case, what you're going to do is, I'm going to use a piece of paper as an example. You're essentially going to knit your button band twice as wide as you normally would, fold it in half inwards, and seam the inside of the button band, or the second half of the button band, to the inside edge of the sweater. So now when you create a buttonhole, you need to create it on the front side and the back side so that when you seam it, they are in alignment. So we're not going to look at all 4 examples of buttonholes in this method. What I want to do is talk to you about the 2 most common that you would most likely use in a double button band situation. Please know that this is not the only 2 methods you could use for that. If you have other methods called for, by all means, trust the pattern, do something different, see what the pattern asks you to do. These are just what I would think, they're the ones that I have used myself and are probably the most common that you would see in a double button band application. So if you were going to be creating a double wide button band or a doubled buttoned band with a picked up and knit edge, I think the most common method you would probably see is the one row buttonhole. So the construction of the buttonhole itself doesn't change for a double button band. However, twice as many holes will need to be created in the work. The horizontal placement of the buttonhole across the double width of the button band needs to match. If we look at the example on the screen, you can see we've now got 2 buttonholes created exactly the same, and they are placed not only equidistant from the 2 outer edges of the button band, but they are also equidistant from the center line of the button band, basically where you would fold the button band. You could also simply consider this 2 times the distance between the edges of the button band and the buttonhole. I think the other application that we would typically see in a double button band would be if we were working an inline button band, so it's knit the same direction that our sweater is worked, and we would use the vertical buttonhole method. The construction for a button band that is double wide using the vertical buttonhole method can be done either, again, in part of the garment, knit at the same time as the sweater, or if it's created separately and then sewn onto the garment. You would work all of the stitches on one side of the first buttonhole to create one edge. Then you will break the yarn, rejoin it at the blue dot, and create the space between the 2 edges of the buttonhole, effectively creating the left edge of one buttonhole and the right edge of the next buttonhole. Finally, you will break the yarn again and create the final edge of the second buttonhole by rejoining the yarn at the blue dot and continuing up until all buttonhole edges are the same, and then you will continue working the entire width of the buttonhole again, or button band again. So let's take a moment and talk a little bit about reinforcing your buttonholes. This was something that when I started out knitting, I didn't do. Reinforcing buttonholes is something that I have started to do more recently, especially when I'm making garments that will be worn as an overlayer, right? Where you might be doing the buttons up and doing up and undoing the buttons several times throughout the course of one wear of the garment. The more you push a button through a buttonhole, the more it can stretch out. So reinforcing that buttonhole just helps it keep its shape a little bit longer. If you've got a yarn over buttonhole, either a single or a double, no, I'm going to say it's mostly just for the single. For the double, you probably want to do a little reinforcement. For a single, it's so small, I think you would have a hard time not compromising the actual circumference of the buttonhole. All this to say, to reinforce my buttonholes, what I do is take a length of yarn that matches the project, thread it through my tapestry needle, and whip stitch all the way around the edge of my buttonhole. It creates a really nice finished edge to the buttonhole, but also prevents it from getting overstretched throughout the course of a day. If you are knitting a double button band, you definitely want to reinforce your buttonholes. And in that case, it's not only reinforcing, but connecting them. So what you'd want to do is once your garment or your button band is seamed to the inside of the garment, so it's completely closed up, you'll put a whip stitch around the entire edge of the buttonhole, but you'll want to make sure it goes through both layers of the fabric at the edge of the buttonhole. You don't want to be trying to push a buttonhole through two consecutive buttonholes if they're not joined. You could end up pushing the button through the first layer, the layer closest to you, and have it sit between your two layers of button band. Now, it's not to say that that's unfixable. You can always continue to push the button through the second hole, but I just think it makes for a better user experience if you can whip stitch that buttonhole both edges together so it just appears to be one buttonhole. Okay, my friends, we are going to wrap it up there. I have said buttonholes and button bands way too many times on a day when it's 105 degrees outside and the temperature is only increasing here inside. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, and actually I think a couple times during the episode, the methods of construction that I've talked about today are not the only ones out there. I would obviously encourage you to try these ones, but if you come across other methods, have fun learning them. There are so many different ways to make buttonholes, and you need to find the one that makes you the happiest. So before we wrap up the video for the day, I just want to go back to last week's video and offer a little clarification about a comment that I received on the video. There was just confusion about the way I worded having a wider body and how it would impact the length of the sleeves. So in my video, I said, if your body gets wider, it pushes the sleeves, or it doesn't push the I worded it very oddly in any case. And I just want to make sure that it's understood that as the width of the body gets wider, and because it's the same width as the shoulder, the wider the body is relative to your shoulders, the farther the sleeve gets started down your body. So if I have 12-inch wide shoulders and I'm knitting a garment that is 12 inches wide at my shoulders, my sleeve starts right here, and I can knit a sleeve that is 17 inches long because I have 17-inch long arms. If I am knitting a garment that is 24 inches wide relative to my 12-inch wide shoulders, the remaining fabric that is wider than my shoulder pushes down the sleeve. That's why we call it a drop shoulder, or I should say pushes down the arm, and our sleeve now starts here rather than here. So we have to make up the difference for how much width of the body gets pushed down the arm before we start our sleeves. So a wider body means you will knit shorter sleeves. Your wingspan is still the same. So your total length from wrist to wrist will not change. It's just as the body gets wider, your sleeve has to compensate and be shorter. So I hope that clarifies any confusion. I do apologize. As I try to explain these concepts, I get excited and I do tend to stumble over my words sometimes. I do my best to clarify, but thank you to the user who left that comment. I'm sure you're not the only one who found it confusing. So if you have questions about last week's video or this week's video, leave a comment below and I will make sure it gets clarified in a future video. Next week, not today, I'm not shooting any more videos today. Next week, we are going to take a look at short rows, specifically converting from one method of short rows to another. In my time as a virtual assistant for a couple of designers, I have seen a lot of questions about people who feel more comfortable with the German short row method, which is also my favorite method, but a lot of designers still use the wrap and turn method of construction. So we're going to look at how to convert one method to the other so that you're not compromising on stitch counts. And folks, we're at that time in the video when I ask for your help. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would really appreciate it if you would hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It helps the YouTube algorithms know that I'm doing a good job and allows my videos to help other people here on YouTube on their knitting journey. Thank you so much for being here, my friends. I hope to see you next week where we talk about short rows. Have fun playing with buttonholes. Stay cool wherever you are. And happy knitting.